Welcome to Chess News. It's been another exciting day of chess, and I'm of course referring to the game between Morozevich and Kramnik that was played today during the third round of the Tal Memorial Tournament in Moscow. So I want to take a look at that game. Let's get started. d4, d5, c4, c6. Now Kramnik defends himself with his favorite Slav, of course. I think he's been doing that probably exclusively over the last few years, maybe. Knight bd7, this is the Moran. And the most topical move here is bishop d3, but queen c2, as played by Morozevich, is also very common, and already signals what his intentions are. Because after bishop d6, he plays here the sharp pawn sacrifice g4. Now this is well-known theory, it's a well-known idea, and I suppose it suits Morozevich's style very well. He's a very sharp attacking player, and he likes to strive for tactical complications on the board. And I suppose with this move, g2, g4, he has a great chance of achieving that. Okay, now one decent try to defend against the threatened pawn push of g4 to g5 is of course h6. But Kramnik here takes the pawn with knight takes g4, and both methods are fine. Now the point, of course, of the pawn sacrifice is that white can now play rook g1, attacking the knight here, and also behind the knight the pawn on g7. Now temporarily black wins a second pawn with knight takes h2, and threatens also to take the knight on f3. So white is now forced first to take the knight on h2, and after bishop takes h2 he plays rook takes g7, regaining at least one of his pawns. Now with the rook here on g7, of course there is a threat to the h pawn in combination with the queen on c2. So if nothing else, I suppose white could try and regain that pawn also. I'm not sure though if Morozevich would play like that, would he be given the chance, because he's of course a player that would like to maintain the initiative. Anyway, Kramnik does not give him a chance to think about this, because he defends the pawn with knight f8. This knight move also has the added benefit of freeing the square d7 for the bishop, and then if the queen moves somewhere, let's say to f6, then black can also consider castling queenside. Okay, Morozevich now played rook g2, putting the question to the bishop, and the bishop now retreats to d6. Now, how should white continue? How can he try and develop an initiative here? He has sacrificed one pawn, and of course he must try and conjure up some action. Well, his most important idea is to castle queenside. But in order for him to do so, he first has to develop his bishop, of course, probably along this diagonal somewhere. So that explains why he plays e4. And this move not only frees up the diagonal from c1 to h6, but also puts added pressure here on this central square d5 in black's camp. Now Kramnik played knight g6, rerouting his knight, trying to bring it into contact with the center a little bit more. Also, of course, it blocks the g file, so the rook on g2 is a little bit less active now. And there were a few moves here to consider for white. Maybe Morozevich considered playing e5 here, just kicking the bishop back to e7, after which the position would get some kind of a French character. But I'm not sure if this was to his liking, because if we look at the pawn structure now, we can see, of course, these white center pawns, but they are blocked by black's center pawns. And it also means that white has lost some pressure against the d5 square here. And it is more difficult for him to try and open up the position, to try and use his slight lead in development. So I don't think that he really considered playing e4 e5 after having a short look at it. Also, let's not forget that black has a free h-pawn in this position. So after knight g6 he didn't play e5, but rather developed his bishop with tempo, bishop g5 I should say, of course. Now this attacks the queen, so black must defend. He could have done so with f6, which would have been an interesting move, but the move that Kramnik plays is also fine, I think. Just after bishop g5, interposing his own bishop with bishop e7, trying to trade pieces, because the more pieces that get traded, the less significant white's advantage in development will become, I think. The less attacking chances he will have, and the greater the chances for black maybe to go into some endgame in the longer term and use his free h-pawn. Okay, now Morozevich keeps up tempo by trading the bishops here on e7 and now manages to castle. Now you might wonder, why not take on d5? Because if I count correctly, white is attacking the d5 square no less than 3 times, and it is only protected 2 times. Well, the problem is that for the moment there is this vis-a-vis of the queen against the king on e1. So if white were to play not queenside castles but c takes d5, trying to win a pawn there for instance, black would recapture with e takes d5, and all of a sudden the e-pawn here on e4 is pinned, so white cannot win the pawn on d5. Well, that explains why Morozevich first castles queenside, and now of course he immediately threatens to win the game by taking on d5, opening up the game and just throwing all his pieces at black's king, which is still in the center. So yes, Morozevich has sacrificed a pawn, but it's still the middle game, and we can see that he has completed his development. His pieces have greater mobility, and black must play very carefully now. Okay, since there is now a very serious pressure on his center, Kramnik decides now to release the center himself, and he does so by exchanging on e4. D takes e4. Now, knight takes e4. This brings the knight a little bit closer to white's camp, but still nothing too serious, because Kramnik now kicks the knight away from his center post, and of course the knight could now go to c5, which is a very nice outpost for the knight. You know, it is supported here by the pawn on d4, and it is hitting these rather weak white squares. But the big question is always with a knight on an outpost, can the knight maintain itself there? And if the question is no, then it probably wasn't an outpost to begin with. Because in this position, of course, black can try b6. Now white has the in-between move of queen a4, so if black would now blunder with taking here on c5, then of course there would be queen takes c6 followed with a double attack on king and rook. But after a very simple defensive move like queen c7, the knight is now really threatened, and it should retreat to, let's say, d3 for instance. But after bishop b7, I suppose black is just fine with a pawn to the good. Okay, so back to the position where Kramnik kicked the knight with f7, f5. So, now it's Morozevich's turn. Where to put this knight? I suppose, well, he could have gone to c5, as we just saw. He could also have retreated the knight to c3, maybe to play around with ideas of playing d5 again, you know. This thrust would be quite nicely supported then by the knight on c3 and also the rook on d1. But he decides here to play knight d2. This is also not bad, of course, because maybe he's now eyeing this circuit here. Playing the knight to f3 and then either into e5 at a suitable moment, or to g5, who knows? Or should he also be playing with the idea of, let me remove these arrows, should he also be playing with the idea of playing knight f3 and then d4, d5 and then maybe bringing the knight to d4? Who knows? Anyway, he's keeping a few options open. Kramnik has to think of them, and also still he has to finish his own development, of course, because let's look at these pathetic rooks and the bishop. They're just not doing anything at the moment. It's just for lack of very concrete attacking points that white is not already winning this position. Okay, now Kramnik plays very actively. He chooses to defend himself in an active way. I suppose the most solid and cautious way to go about it would be just to try and finish the development with bishop d7, and then, if given the opportunity, to castle queenside on the next move. And I think that black would be very solid then, a little bit passive maybe, but you know, he still has this extra pawn, and he can hope to stave off any kind of attack and maybe have a better endgame. But he wants to solve his development problems in another way, and after knight d2 he plays here c5. Now this is a very interesting move. Normally the move c6, c5, or also sometimes in a similar way e6, e5, is a freeing move in this type of Slav positions. And it has to do with the fact that, let's go back one move, that both these pawns here, they hamper the activity of the bishop here on c8. So if you manage to push either one of them, the bishop on c8 has a good prospect of becoming active. So that's why Kramnik plays c5, and he wants now to bring his bishop to this diagonal. But, well, Morozevich now takes the pawn on c5. And I suppose that this idea of c6, c5 is not without risk for black. Even though objectively, I suppose his position is still fine. Because if we look at the position, first of all, we can see that white now has regained his pawn. But also, and probably more important, this d file has become a completely open file, and white already has a rook there. Also, this pawn here on c5, if it is left unattended, could be a very disturbing factor for black's camp, when it sometimes pushes itself and tries to rampage, so to speak, black's position. Now there is one more benefit for black also that we should mention. This pawn here on d4, and let me remove these arrows first. This pawn here on d4 was, of course, controlling the e5 square. So this means that now black's pawn majority here in the center has become a little bit more mobile, and I suppose that was also what made Kramnik decide to play this move c6, c5. Anyway, after the capture, d takes c5, Kramnik now developed his bishop to d7, and I don't know, maybe he will be interviewed, or we will read some commentaries of Kramnik about the game later. I'm not sure if he at first even considered to just simply recapture the pawn with queen takes c5. But we should note that then queen d3 is a very strong move for white, just threatening to move this knight out of the way here, for instance, or here, for instance, when there would be a very strong battery over the d file, seriously threatening black's position. So you could imagine that after queen d3, Kramnik would retreat his queen to c7, just to overprotect these vulnerable squares here. But then queen h3 would be very strong for white, threatening rook takes g6, and I don't know, maybe white can also try and enter here over the black squares. I'm not sure, but this would really step up the pressure, I think. So yeah, that probably explains why after d takes c5, Kramnik sticks to his more strategical idea of first solving his opening problems and then starting to think about maybe getting a little bit more active. So he leaves the pawn on c5 for the moment and plays bishop d7. Now, of course, there is less danger of this pawn moving forward and causing any harm to black's position, because now this bishop would be very glad to take it, and leaving the pawn position intact, and of course also attacking white's rook, for instance, in a number of variations. Okay, so after bishop d7, Morozevich, I think, was now very much in his element. And maybe that's why I wonder if c6, c5 was the right choice. Maybe objectively it is good, but subjectively it was probably better to play a move like bishop d7 against a player like Morozevich. Because with this positioned open up like this, you know, d takes c5, bishop d7, Morozevich can now start playing moves like b4, you know. And who knows what is going on? I mean, he now protects his pawn on c5, so there is never a queen takes c5 in the position anymore. And these pawns, even though they are supposed to protect white's king, I suppose, they also pose a very ominous threat over black's soon-to-be queenside king position. Oh gosh, I love my English today. I hope you guys do too. Okay, well, since it is not very safe for black's king to castle kingside, Kramnik decided here to play castles queenside. But now rook g3 is played, and we can already see lovely switches over the third rank here. I think that Morozevich was starting to like his position here, even though objectively I suppose there is still nothing wrong. But maybe you should just not give this kind of position to a player like Morozevich. Anyway, enough said about that now. Kramnik now plays very strategically and very logically. He now moves his pawn majority in the center. And now, you could think that Morozevich would now very much like to play a move like rook a3. And to suppose that is true. And this move attacks the pawn on a7, of course. But I think that black would have a very simple defense. He would simply improve his king, get it away from a white square, and simultaneously protect the pawn on a7. And very important to note is that white does not have the follow-up of queen a4, because of the simple fact that this square is protected by this all-important black bishop. Okay, keep that in mind, because we will see that this is a very important factor very soon in the game. So after e5, this strategical move of Kramnik, Morozevich does not play rook a3, which simply allows black to improve his king with king b8, but rather he plays here rook d3, and he wants to go to the support point here on d6 if given the opportunity. And now, much to my surprise, Kramnik makes a mistake. And maybe you can already feel what is coming. His best move, to my opinion, would have been to continue with his central strategy to play e4, and after a move like rook d6, simply play knight e5. The e5 square has become available for the knight. It is a great outpost, of course, and just note what kind of pressure this super beast is exerting on the position. It is doing both defensive and attacking duties, and, well, I don't see white creating any serious threats yet. Because in order for white to create serious threats, he needs his pieces to cooperate, to work together. And this rook is sitting nicely on d6, but it's not winning the war by itself, right? So I suppose that there could be some danger if this knight from d2 were to move out of the way, because then there would be a battery of both rooks. But even then, if this bishop were to move, then the rook on d8 would also be sufficiently protected. by the other black pieces. So I don't see any real danger for black in this position. I think with a knight on e5 he would be fine. And yeah, let's not forget that he still has this very menacing h-pawn. Okay, but back to the move rook d3, where Kramnik could have played e4, but decided not to. And it makes you wonder, because for a player of the stature of Kramnik, he now makes a strange mistake. He didn't put his bishop on d7 for nothing, and I was starting to wonder, maybe he wants to somehow fool Anand. You know, Anand is watching these games, of course, and maybe he wants to give Anand the impression that if you play these, let's say, more imbalanced positions, you know, with open attacking chances and unbalanced pawn positions and tactical positions, that if Kramnik is under pressure, that maybe he will start to make mistakes. And maybe he hopes Anand to fall for this trap, try to steer for unbalanced positions that are not necessarily objectively good for him, and maybe then Kramnik will be the big defender we all know him to be. Anyway, it's speculation on my side, of course, but he plays here bishop e6. And now, of course, Morozevich seizes his opportunity. He plays now rook a3. He simply switches. And now this attack is very strong, because the queen can go to a4. So it's not what Kramnik played, but had he played king b8, yes, let's click king b8, then queen a4 would have been very strong. Now the best move here is a6, but with this pawn lured forward and being on a wide square, now this move c6 would be very strong. Maybe not winning, but certainly giving Morozevich dangerous attacking chances. Very much to his liking, I suppose. So, I don't know. Maybe Kramnik forgot about the idea that the rook could still go to a3, even though Morozevich had decided to put it on d3. And yeah, maybe he also forgot that then, of course, queen a4 would become possible. Anyway, so after bishop e6, rook a3 was played, and I think that this the sad truth now sunk in with Kramnik. He must have felt immediately that bishop e6 was not the best move. Anyway, he didn't play king b8, he played a6 here. But also in this position, of course, Morozevich has the very strong, disturbing pawn move, c6. Now normally, when both black pawns would have been here, this move could have been answered, if nothing else, with b7, b6. Of course, the bishop would normally take this pawn on c6, but all these options are now not possible. So it's now all hands on deck. Kramnik now really has to start defending. And let's see how he does that. He starts by playing b takes c6 in this position. Let's note that queen takes b4 was also possible, but then c takes b7 is very strong and the king cannot recapture then. Let's execute that for a moment because of the simple pin with rook b3, winning the queen, of course. So after c takes b7 check, probably queen takes b7 is forced, but then the move c5 is very, very strong, winning for white. We can see that this move opens up the diagonal for white's bishop, and this point here on a6, it's just dead, you know. This bishop or the rook is going to appear there, and I suppose that the queen will find a way to penetrate black position also. This pawn is very strong, also participating in the attack. And these pieces, they are just too far away from the scene of the action, so this would be a winning position for white. Okay, this explains why Kramnik did not take on b4 in this position, but rather played b takes c6. And yeah, maybe now he's playing with the idea of taking the pawn on b4, which explains in turn why Morozevich now first plays c5, blocking the diagonal for the queen here, and again opening up also the bishop diagonal. This pawn here on a6, it will not go anywhere, you know, so we will just take it in any of the coming moves. So again, Kramnik is faced with an uphill defensive task here, and I think he now makes another mistake. Probably the most tenacious move here would have been to play queen h4. This at least has the benefit that it will attack or cover a few squares over the fourth ring, and also this pawn here. At least he would hit these two weak pawns and have some defensive chances in certain lines. What he did play, however, after c5, was queen g5, and I think he was already playing with the idea here of playing king e7 on the next move, which means that it is very important when the king appears here on the d file that of course this knight on d2 is pinned, because otherwise there would follow an immediate winning check of the d file. So that explains why Kramnik probably wanted to put his queen here to try and pin the knight. But this idea is simply, defensively speaking, not strong enough. It doesn't do the job. Also, the knight on d2, be it pinned, is well protected for the moment, and white can just develop his queenside attack. So, Morozevich did so by playing rook takes a6. Now king d7 was played, just trying to escape with the king, to run to the king side, or to find at least some shelter, maybe in the center even. But Morozevich continues very strongly now. We can see that there is one very important defender left of the white squares around black's king, and that's the bishop here on e6. And we can also see that this bishop here on f1 hasn't made a single move in the game, so it only makes sense that Morozevich now develops it and also wants to exchange the defender on e6. Okay, now this threatens, by the way, also to play rook a7, which would mean that black's king would have to let go of the defense of the bishop on e6, so Kramnik now felt obliged to play bishop takes c4. But this, of course, enables queen takes c4. And now we can see what exchanges of this kind actually bring to an attacker. Beforehand, it was not possible for white's queen to go to c4 in this position, right? Because then it would simply be taken by the bishop. So Morozevich first exchanged the bishop, now the queen can go to c4, and now we can see that he is threatening to enter the position with moves like this, or maybe first after a check to go to a square like c6, for instance. Okay, this explains knight e7, because at least this shelters the black king when it appears on e8. And now probably the strongest move would have been here to play queen f7, with the very funny tactical idea, but very probably overlooked by Morozevich, of playing f2 f4. Now, what is the idea of f2 f4? If black were to recapture with this pawn, then of course there would no longer be a pin of the knight on d2, and white would win with a move such as knight e4, discovered check on the king, and also an attack on the queen. Okay, let me remove these arrows so I can explain to you the other point, that is the idea of f4. The other point of f4 is that if black takes with the queen, then he no longer defends the knight on e7. And then, of course, the move rook a7 has become possible, winning with taking on e7 afterwards. Okay, so queen f7 would have been an immediately winning punch. Well, we can forgive Morozevich for missing that, because f2, f4 is really a very chic move. But what he does is also quite sufficient. He plays here, after knight e7, king c2, simply unpinning the knight, and now threatening moves like knight f3 check, or knight e4 check, immediately winning, of course. Okay, so it only makes sense that Kramnik now steps out of the d-file, finally. He brings his king to e8, where it still is in relative safety, but of course white's position is winning. Knight f3 followed now. Now also the knight is going to join into the attack, and probably this is where Kramnik misses his last, most tenacious defense, even though it doesn't really help him. Queen g8 would have been a possibility, but then after rook takes d8 check, king takes e8, and queen c3, white simply shifts his attention to the black squares and attacks the pawn on e5. But, you know, it is exactly this shifting of attention that a strong chess player needs to be able to do. So that's why a move like queen g8 is always more tenacious, because, you know, the defender, the attacker always has to come up with new ideas in this case. Now we can see, of course, that after queen c3, a move like e4 would be losing to rook a8 check. And if black tries to defend, well, it's not really defending the pawn on e5, but if he tries to defend the position, so to say, with queen d5, then of course knight takes e5 wins a very important pawn, and we can see that the rook here is in danger. This pawn is in danger. There is a threat here of rook a8. This is simply a losing position for black. Okay, well then, what did Kramnik play in the game after knight f3? He played here queen f6. But now Morozevich finished the job with rook d6. He attacks the queen, of course, with rook d6. Also attacks the c-pawn, but that is less relevant. I suppose that, yeah. Let me see. Yeah, the thing is that if the queen now moves to, let's say, f7, then of course, yeah, this attacks the queen on c4. Then white can win with rook takes d8. King takes e8, yes, of course. And now the queen on s7 is no longer protected. And if the black queen goes to a square, let's say like g7, then he has let gone of the protection of the e6 square, and then queen e6 is of course a very strong penetrating move. Black can resign this position. So this explains why after rook d6, rook takes d6 was what he played, but after c takes d6, he resigned the game. The threat, of course, here is to take the knight on e7, like this, and also, simultaneously, to play rook a8 check, endangering the rook here in the corner. And a move like queen d6 is not possible because of that check. And would it be possible then to move the knight out of the way, let's say to d5? Well, that is possible, of course, but then the protection of c6 has gone, and queen c6 would be very simply winning, of course. So, after c takes d6, Kramnik resigned. Well, great achievement for Morozevich. Yeah, quite a strange moment here on, I think it was the 21st move. Yes, let's go back to that for one moment. After rook d3, Morozevich was playing with the idea of playing rook d6, and then, I don't know, maybe Kramnik's attention just slipped, and he played here bishop e6, probably just forgetting about the idea of rook a3. and then king b8, queen a4. And after that it was just downhill for Kramnik. He had a position that was very hard to defend. He could have done it a bit more tenaciously on 2 or 3 moments in time, I suppose, but you know, it's never easy to defend these positions, and I suppose that in the end all these options were losing. So he was just given only one chance, and he made full use of it. Kudos to Morozevich. I hope you've I hope you've enjoyed this video analysis. I hope to see you again some other time. Thank you for watching. Bye bye.